Boycotts work in the Olympics. We saw it with South Africa. From that standpoint, I think it's very, very important what the IOC did with Russia. It's one of the few acts of real courage the IOC has ever committed.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I am covering the two biggest political stories of the moment. The first, here in the United States. The second, kicking off in Paris. Number one, after President Biden's stunning withdrawal from the 2024 race, Democrats have acted with remarkable speed and solidarity, passing the torch to Vice President Kamala Harris.
I revere this office, but I love my country more. Nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
And at the same time, the world's most elite athletes are gathering along the Seine in Paris, lighting a more literal torch of the Olympic variety. See what I did there? The US presidential campaign has already had more twists and turns than an Olympic surfing competition. New sport this year, by the way, in the former French colony of Tahiti. Wish I was going. But the world will keep spinning, regardless of what political bombshell drops next in Washington. So today, I'm going to say a few words about this unprecedented week, in an unprecedented month in the United States, and then we're going to talk about the Olympics. First, to the United States. As Vladimir Lenin never actually said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. The United States is quickly tilting into the latter camp. A reminder that the cataclysmic CNN debate between Biden and Trump was barely a month ago. Then came Trump's survival, just barely, of an assassination attempt in rural Pennsylvania. That was followed by his nomination of Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his vice president pick, followed by Trump's emotional coronation at one of the most united RNC conventions in modern history. Then Biden got COVID. Then Biden was under pressure. He dropped out of the race, and in about the blink of an eye, the Democratic establishment rallied behind Kamala Harris as the new candidate. Oh, and somewhere in that mix, this happened.
Enough was enough! And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother!
But as chaotic and, well, stressful, right? Stressful as the last few weeks have been, one truth remains. Presidential campaigns are about stories. The candidate with the best story wins. So with just about 100 days to go until Election Day, what stories will Trump and Harris tell? First to Harris. She's going to run as the seasoned prosecutor against the convicted criminal.
Before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump is not happy to lose Joe Biden as a foil. But behind the bluster, you can bet that the GOP is already trying to game out which tried and true Biden attacks will no longer work on Harris. And for example, she's 19 years younger and a much more fluent speaker than Trump, and which will still very much stick, like tying her to the border crisis and inflation. And just one last point here. There's still plenty of time until Election Day. Heck, most democracies around the world run their entire campaigns in less time than 100 days. See Britain and France this summer. So yes, we're in the final round of the 2024 campaign, but there's still quite a while for our democratic process to stick the landing. Speaking of tortured metaphors, let's turn to the five-ringed variety. It's time to talk about the Paris Olympics, just getting underway as I speak. Geopolitics will loom particularly large at this year's games, and joining me in just a moment, best-selling author and seasoned Washington Post sports columnist, Sally Jenkins. Sally Jenkins, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
This is our first show on sports, so who knows where it's going to go. But it's about time. We've got the Paris Olympics, and what are you excited about, worried about?
Well, you know, the French are trying to do something that's so elaborate.
On the Seine.
On the Seine, where they're planning to have over 300,000 spectators, boats, people lined up on the balconies of these, ancient old homes along the Seine. The logistics of the opening ceremonies will be the first real test. There's so much that could go wrong. And yet, they're trying to do this really massive undertaking. normally an opening ceremonies is in a stadium with maybe 80,000 people. You're talking about something that's 3 times more complicated than anything any country has attempted to do before with an opening ceremonies.
At a time of not only great disinformation, but with a major war going on in Europe and the Russians causing a lot of trouble. I mean, you have to think that the French Olympics are an attractive target for them right now.
Of course they are. And this is really the first time that the IOC, which normally is the great friend of dictators, it's certainly at the moment very close to Xi Jinping, to the point that they actually exonerated 23 swimmers who tested positive for drugs. This is the first time that the IOC has really made an enemy out of Vladimir Putin. Normally, they're sitting with Putin in a VIP box. Normally, Putin is considered, a great friend to the Olympics. But in this case, because of the sanction against Russian athletes over the Ukraine war, you've got a real enemy in Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin does not deal kindly with his enemies.
I mean, they can still participate, the Russian athletes. They're still allowed to participate by the Russian government, but under a neutral IOC flag.
Correct. So Putin doesn't get quite the prestige that he would like from an Olympics exercise, which is what he's really in it for. The reason he hosted the Sochi Games was to sort of disarm the world on the eve of his antics and invasions. And so he's not getting that now. The Russians will be, stigmatized by competing under this neutral flag, and it's a blow to his prestige, and he's clearly quite angry about it. And the campaign of disinformation so far has been really, really ugly. And there's no evidence whatsoever that when Putin is unhappy, he just stops at disinformation.
Yeah, there's been a lot of fake AI-generated disinformation I've seen. I mean, the U.S. elections, we haven't seen that much of it yet. But compared to other Olympics that you've covered, and you've covered a bunch of them, are your concerns highest in the run-up to France?
Yes, normally the concerns over an Olympics are largely environmental. There's been COVID Olympics where you really worried about the IOC's transparency and honesty in whether they could keep so many athletes and spectators safe from germs. Okay, there have been other Olympics where you knew, for instance, in Rio, that the water athletes would be swimming in was not going to be clean despite every promise. This is different by several magnitudes, because one of the things Russia is doing with its AI campaign and its cyber campaign, it appears, is whipping up fears of terrorism, which in turn may invite terrorism. The Palestinian issue is really frightening in its vehemence, and some of the AI that appears to be coming from Russian sources is almost baiting them, if you ask me. I mean, I'm not a national security expert, but it certainly is inviting the idea of violence in Paris.
No, French leaders I've spoken to, have absolutely raised the alarm specifically about Russia disinfo and cyber intrusions in the past months. And it does seem like they are bearing the brunt of those efforts right now.
I mean, one of the things that they could cause is panic, in areas with really, really large groups of people. I mean, this is going to be the most urban Olympics and also one of the most sprawling Olympics I've ever seen. You're talking about events in all the major districts in Paris, inside Paris, in very old stadiums. One of the great things about the Paris Olympics is that they haven't built a whole lot of new structures. They're actually going to be holding events at already existing buildings that are very entrenched deeply into the city of Paris. They're also going to be holding events across the entire country. They're going to be having events in Marseille. They're having surfing in Tahiti. So it's a really, really sprawling logistical problem. And between drones, cyber security, and all of the new concerns in the world, this is going to be the most difficult Olympics to secure by a long shot.
So, politics all over these Olympics, given the world we're living in right now. You mentioned the Palestinian issue. A lot of Palestinians saying that the Israelis should have to also compete under a neutral flag, given the war in Gaza right now. How much do you think politics should and should not play a role in the Olympics generally? The athletes clearly have very, very different views about this.
Well, the Olympic truce is a wonderful idea, and in large measure, it can work. I think one of the reasons other Olympics have been secure in dicey situations is because there's been so much brotherly collaboration between governments that otherwise have tensions. They all agree to set things aside and cooperate in sharing security and contributing to the enormous cost of that. But this is probably one of the most divisive eras we've ever faced. And you've got some actors here who are not necessarily rational government actors, right? And so that's part of the problem. Now, I'll say this. I think that if Putin wants to crawl back into, some sort of, brotherhood of government leaders, this is a good opportunity to do it, to actually, become part of the solution here rather than the creator of tension. That might go a long way towards resolving some of his issues. And by the way, Russia is a sports crazy nation. One of the reasons the Sochi Games was important to him, and one of the reasons why he's so irritated, is because they do love their competition just like we do. So things like boycotts and things like sanctions can really hurt him domestically. And I think that's one reason why he's aggravated. As far as politics and the Olympics, one of the great acts of resistance that really, really worked was the boycott of South Africa. South Africa very badly in the end wanted to join the international sports movement because sports were very important to that country. Boycotts work in the Olympics. We saw it with South Africa. And so from that standpoint, I think it's very, very important what the IOC did with Russia. It's one of the few acts of real courage the IOC has ever committed. And so I think they're to be congratulated for that.
Clearly, it's a tool, and I see that embarrassment of Putin being a problem. Now, on the other hand, an authoritarian country that has done a much better job with sports recently has been Saudi Arabia. Right? I mean, throwing an enormous amount of money around into golf, into tennis, into the World Cup, very successfully. Talk a little bit about the sports washing debate and the pros and cons there.
Well, you're talking to someone who works for the Washington Post. And so my view of Saudi Arabia is not nearly as congratulatory. I think Saudi Arabia actually has a lot more to prove before they should be allowed to invest.
And by the way, I mean, just for the audience, let me make it clear. When you say the Washington Post, it's because, of course, Jamal Khashoggi, who was assassinated by the Saudi regime, was a Washington Post reporter.
Yes, a Washington Post columnist assassinated by the regime. I'll be much more willing to look at Saudi Arabia's reforms and so-called progress on, say, women's rights. When they stop kidnapping women, when they stop arresting women merely for protesting basic civil rights issues. So I actually think that the world is being far too kind to Saudi Arabia. To me, the appropriate limit for whether you're talking about the IOC accepting sponsorship or whether you're talking about the US Open tennis tournament accepting sponsorship dollars, American companies do a very, very sensible thing, most of them. They cap capital foreign investment at 20%. So in other words, a foreign government cannot buy the NBA because their investment is limited to 20%. That to me is the real common sense solution for bodies like the IOC. We should never be in a position where we allow Saudi Arabia to simply buy golf, which is what they've been attempting to do, or simply buy women's tennis, which is something they're attempting to do, simply in order to look better both at home and abroad. Sports washing is important not just because it's a moral issue. Sports washing is important because the more you entangle foreign money with your companies and with your entities, the harder it is for our State Department to do its job and our presidents to do their job by drawing red lines because the stakes rise with the finances. That's why it matters. And that's why things like the Olympics matter as far as sports washing. You don't want Chinese money or Saudi Arabian money so compromise you that you cannot take the right diplomatic stand. I think what you'll end up seeing with the PGA Tour and Live Golf is, again, some kind of sensible cap on Saudi money that does not turn over governorship of worldwide golf to the state fund of Saudi Arabia.
I want to ask you about the NBA, right, which on the one hand has seemed to be really leaning into a whole bunch of political issues that would be seen as forward-looking and progressive in the United States. I also see that China's an absolutely critical market for them, and they have been deeply problematic in the way they've responded, for example, to Hong Kong issues, to Taiwan issues, and others. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Enormous wealth is coming out and enormous exposure is coming out of that relationship, and yet China can squeeze the NBA. And this is the danger in engaging in over-engagement. Engagement is good, but when you literally leverage yourself so commercially that you've let the anaconda into your house, into your cell phones, into your TikTok videos, you are really asking to be choked to death. It's one thing to go to the Beijing for the Olympics once, but to go twice was a serious mistake. What you find is that we are not changing their behaviors, they're changing our behaviors. And this is a critical point. That idea that somehow we could change China's behavior, that Xi Jinping was going to be someone else, that Vladimir Putin was going to behave as someone else just because he loved Western money, has turned out to be utterly false.
I mean, wouldn't we be better off at the end of the day if we just got rid of all the flags at these events and just let athletes compete as athletes?
I don't think the flags are the problem. I think the United States Olympic movement is one of the great opportunities for kids in this country. I think that it's aspirational. I love the Olympic movement. One of the things that happens at every Olympics is that the kids come in, the athletes come in, and they clean it all up. Their effort and their commitment to compete for 4 high-stakes minutes after training for 4 years is one of the great competitive miracles we all get to watch, and it's a remarkable event in that way. They really scrape the grime off the Olympics for me in a lot of ways. A Sakari Richardson when she runs, or a Simone Biles when she competes, you forget everything. I don't think the flags are the problem. I think the commerce is the problem. Clean up the commerce. I think the money is where, if you start to organize, as we've been talking about in this whole conversation, if you start to organize the sponsorship ties in a more sensible way, if you use the awarding of the games themselves as a reward rather than as an act of corruption, then I think the flags are okay. But if we continue to award Olympics to bad actors just for their cash, just because we've bloated the Olympics so badly that we don't have any legit offers to hold these games in places that celebrate human rights, and so we're going to human rights violators, and as they're building stadiums, they're committing even more human rights violations, then you're right, take the flags away.
How about if we make the IOC a little bit more like the IMF, and if you're granting an Olympics to a major country, there are reforms that are actually intrinsic and required in order for you to pull those games off?
Unfortunately, that is supposed to be in place. The Olympic Charter, the Olympic contract, supposedly holds the host to those very things, and they violate them every single time. And every human rights organization on the face of the earth pleads with the IOC for 4 years, please hold them to their contract. And they allow Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin to break the contracts every single time. They displace people, they beat people, they hit them with cattle prods. When you're not cooperating in the great state ideology and state exercise of hosting the Olympics for international prestige. And so that's the problem. One potential solution, I think number one, I think that the IOC should have to turn over its governing membership much, much more rapidly. You've got people who've been in there for 40, 50 years.
Really?
So new leadership.
On the board?
Yes, on the board, which really entrenches corruption. Number two, there is something to be said for thinking about holding the Olympics on one site and not awarding it to different cities.
Sally Jenkins, thanks so much for joining us on GZERO today.
My pleasure.
That's our show this week. Come back next week, and if you like what you see, or even if you don't, you think, hey, I could be a gold medalist in my own mind, or at least a bronze, I want to take a moment to sign up for our most excellent daily newsletter, appropriately titled GZERO Daily.